December 1944. The cold was so bitter it felt like it could steal your breath away. In the quiet of the Ardennes, under a thick blanket of snow, the world seemed to be frozen in time. Every gust of wind cut through the trees like a blade, carrying with it the silence of a land torn apart by war. Amidst the frozen landscape, one person was moving through the snow, struggling against the elements. Elise Moreau, a nurse from the French Red Cross. She wasn't there to fight. She was there to save, to find any survivors, to offer a moment of hope in the darkest of times. Then a sound, a faint groan, weak but unmistakable. It came from the snow. She ran, heart racing, and there, almost buried in the freezing white blanket, was a soldier, an American officer, his face pale, his uniform torn, and his leg twisted at a sickening angle. He was alive, but barely. This is just one story, but it is not the only one. Countless stories of survival, courage, and sacrifice have been left in the dust of history. Welcome to the channel. If you believe these stories should never be forgotten, join us. Subscribe now and turn on the notifications to help keep every memory and every story alive. Without further delay, let's get straight to the point. The wind howled through the trees, biting at her face as she struggled to carry him. His body, limp and barely responsive, was heavy in her arms, but she didn't care. She wasn't going to leave him behind. Every step she took felt like it was pulling her deeper into the cold. But she pushed forward, her breath quick and shallow, focusing only on the cabin ahead. When she finally reached the small, abandoned shack, she barely had the strength to close the door behind her. The man in her arms, breathing in shallow gasps, had become almost weightless. She could feel his pulse fluttering faintly, but she wasn't sure how much time she had left. She couldn't afford to waste another second. She set him down gently on the floor, her hands shaking from the cold and the pressure of the moment. His body was battered and bruised, the uniform torn and stained, but the most alarming injury was his leg, a wound so severe it could no longer hide beneath the fabric. Her fingers, trained from years of nursing, worked quickly as she cut away the rest of his clothing to assess the damage. His skin was pale, his lips blue, and his body trembled with the signs of severe shock. She started a fire, its warmth filling the small space, trying to heat him from the inside. As the flames flickered, she worked with precision. His leg was a mess, bone broken, flesh torn, and blood oozing from the wound. There was little she could do to stop the bleeding, but she had to try. The sound of him groaning, each movement causing him to flinch, tugged at her heart, but he said nothing. Only one word left his lips in a desperate whisper: Jonathan. The days that followed were a blur. She did what she could, using what little medical supplies she had left. His body was a battlefield of its own, fighting to hold on while the elements outside fought to claim him. His fever spiked, and she wiped his brow, speaking softly to him in the dark, even though she knew he couldn't hear her. Every night, the same word escaped his lips: Jonathan. It haunted her, like a ghost she couldn't shake. It wasn't until days later, when the fever had finally broken, that he stirred. His eyes flickered open slowly, as though he was unsure of where he was or even who he was. She was by his side in an instant, her hands on his face, trying to steady him. "Hey, take it easy," she whispered, her voice shaky from exhaustion. "You're safe now." His gaze was unfocused at first, but then he blinked, trying to clear the haze from his mind. He looked at her, his expression distant, as though he couldn't remember how he had ended up there. Who? His voice was hoarse, his words slow, as though he had to fight to form them. "Where am I?" She watched him closely, relieved to see some awareness in his eyes. "You're in a safe place," she answered gently. "You were injured, but you're going to be okay." He blinked again, confusion clouding his face, before the fog seemed to lift. "Richard," he muttered. his hand reaching out instinctively. Major Richard Callahan, 101st Airborne. The name came with a weight that sent a chill down her spine. The 101st. They had been the ones fighting on the front lines, the ones facing the hardest battles. She had heard stories, but this wasn't just any soldier. This was a man who had survived more than anyone should. But as his name echoed through the room, a new silence settled in. His eyes lost focus again, this time deeper, as if searching for something he couldn't find. What happened? His voice was barely above a whisper. How did I get here? She didn't have an answer for him. The confusion in his eyes was matched only by the darkness of the memories he was trying to piece together. All she knew was that he had come to her somehow, through as he lay in the cold, recovering from his injuries. Bits and pieces of the past started to come back to him. The fog in his mind began to lift, but it left behind confusion and fragments of a time he wished he could forget. He remembered the secret meeting clearly now, the one with American and British officers, gathered in a hidden room, talking about a crucial operation. The plan had been to secure a tungsten mine in the Ardennes, a resource that was vital for the war effort. He had been a part of it, deeply involved, the weight of the mission resting on his shoulders. They had needed that mine, needed it badly. But then, something had gone terribly wrong. He remembered holding a glass, a drink that tasted sharp and cold, but then nothing. The world had gone dark. When he woke up, the snow was falling heavily, covering his body like a shroud. He had been abandoned, left alone in the freezing wilderness, his clothes soaked and his body aching. He couldn't make sense of it. What had happened? Who had done this to him? One name kept echoing in his mind, like a haunting whisper in the dark. Lieutenant Jonathan Reed, his assistant, his right-hand man, the one person he had trusted more than anyone else in that entire room. Had Jonathan betrayed him? Had the man who had stood by his side turned on him when the chips were down? His heart twisted at the thought. He had considered Jonathan like a brother, someone who had earned his trust over and over. How could it be? In a war like this, could a betrayal like that truly happen? The questions churned inside him, gnawing at his mind. He wanted to believe that it was all a misunderstanding, a cruel twist of fate. But in the depths of his heart, he knew better. The war had a way of revealing people's true colors, and in the end, not everyone was who they appeared to be. His mind wandered back to the moment when everything had changed. That drink, had it been laced with something? Had Jonathan known? The doubts clouded his thoughts, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The trust he had once placed in his comrade was shattered, replaced by an insidious doubt that would haunt him for the rest of his life. As the days passed, the snow continued to fall, and with each passing hour, the weight of his betrayal grew heavier. What had Jonathan done? And more importantly, what had he been a part of in that dark, secret room? The war raged on, but for him, the real battle had just begun. It wasn't the enemy he needed to fear anymore. It was the shadow of betrayal lurking within the very ranks of the men he had once called brothers. Elise had seen too much of war to flinch at the sight of suffering. Her hands, rough and calloused from years of tending to the wounded, moved with practiced precision. Her gaze, calm and steady, never wavered, even in the face of the horrors around her. She had lost so much. Her brother, among the fallen, at Dunkirk. The war had taken so many from her, ripped apart families and left countless empty spaces where loved ones once stood. She understood the pain. She knew it all too well. But in the midst of the destruction, she also knew something else: the value of every single life. Even when the world seemed to crumble, there was still worth in the fight to save one more, to give one more person a chance. The man lying before her, battered and broken, was a stranger. His face was unfamiliar, and She had no idea who he was, what role he had played in the war, or if he had a family waiting for him somewhere. But that didn't matter. She wasn't going to let him slip away, not on her watch. As the days passed, she tended to his injuries, refusing to let him succumb to the cold or the pain. When his body began to stir, when the weakness in his limbs started to fade, she was there. She helped him sit up, supported him as he tried to stand, and fashioned makeshift crutches to help him walk. The recovery was slow, but it was progress, and it was enough. The work didn't stop there. They gathered wood, built fires, and did whatever they could to keep going, to survive. What began as simple care turned into something deeper. A quiet companionship formed between them, something unspoken yet undeniable. They shared moments of silence by the fire, their words few, but their connection growing stronger with each passing day. In the midst of the war, amidst all the chaos, Elise had found something she hadn't expected. A bond forged in the quiet moments, in the shared understanding of loss, survival, and the fragile thread that connected them both. It wasn't just about the work anymore, about tending to wounds or cutting wood. It was about trust, about knowing that even in the darkest of times, they weren't truly alone. And perhaps, in the end, that was the most important thing of all. One cold morning, Elise decided it was time to teach him how to hunt. The forest, blanketed in thick snow, stood still and silent around them, as if it too were holding its breath. The only sounds were the crunch of their footsteps in the snow and the occasional creak of the trees bending under the weight of the winter. The air was sharp, and everything felt like a world frozen in time. He struggled to keep up with her, his steps clumsy and uncertain. Every time he moved, branches snapped underfoot, sending echoes through the quiet woods. He was too loud, too aware of his own presence in a world that demanded silence. He wasn't a hunter, not like her. She moved with ease, her body knowing the rhythm of the land, her every step as deliberate as the others before it. Then, without warning, a rustling in the distance shattered the stillness. From behind the trees, a massive bear emerged, its fur matted and dirty, eyes glinting with hunger and aggression. The bear was on edge, its primal instincts triggered by the cold and the search for food. It saw them, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. The Major froze, fear gripping him like nothing he had ever felt before. In battle, he had faced death countless times, yet the sight of this wild creature filled him with a deep, paralyzing terror. The air seemed to thicken, his heart pounding in his chest as he found himself unable to move. But Elise didn't hesitate. In one fluid motion, she raised her old rifle, its wood worn from years of use, and aimed it at the sky. With a loud crack, the gunshot rang out, splitting the air and echoing through the trees. The bear, startled by the noise, hesitated for only a moment before turning, retreating into the forest from which it had come. The danger passed, but the fear lingered in the Major's chest, tight and suffocating. He had felt fear before, many times in battle, but this was different. This was a fear of something he couldn't control, something wild and unpredictable, and it had shaken him to his core. Elise turned to him, her expression calm, as if she had faced such moments countless times. She lowered her rifle, her eyes soft but knowing. "You must learn not to fear the forest," she said, her voice steady. "Fear will only make you weak, and in a world like this, weakness can be deadly." The Major swallowed, his mind still racing from the encounter. She had saved him, again. And in that moment, he realized something he hadn't fully understood before. It wasn't just about surviving the war. It was about surviving everything that came after it. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the small cabin. The warmth it provided felt like a fragile cocoon in the otherwise cold and unforgiving world. Outside, the wind howled, a constant reminder of the war that raged on, both in the distance and deep within the hearts of those who had lived through it. In the stillness of the night, with only the sound of the flames to accompany them, Richard handed Elise a small silver compass. She took it carefully, her fingers brushing over its smooth surface. The metal was cool, despite the fire's heat, and the engraving on the back was worn, faded by time and use. Richard's gaze was distant as he spoke, his voice low, as if the words themselves carried a weight that had been buried for far too long. "It belonged to my father," he said, his eyes flickering for a moment to the flickering flame. "He carried it through the First World War. He always said it pointed to home. No matter where he was, no matter how far he traveled, it never failed to point him back." Elise studied the compass in her hand, her brow furrowing slightly as she absorbed his words. She could feel the history in it, the countless memories and miles it had crossed. A small, simple thing, yet it carried so much meaning. She looked up at him, her voice soft but curious. "And where is your home now?" she asked, her gaze meeting his. Richard's eyes flickered, a shadow crossing his face as if he were searching for an answer in the depths of his own soul. He swallowed, but when he spoke, his voice was steady, despite the turmoil that seemed to swirl inside him. "I'm still trying to figure that out," he replied, his words tinged with a hint of sadness. "I've been running for so long. But sometimes the answers aren't so easy to find." The room fell silent for a moment as Elise held the compass in her palm, the quiet crackle of the fire the only sound between them. She understood in some way what he meant. The war had stolen so much from them both, and the world seemed to have blurred their sense of purpose and belonging. The lines between right and wrong, home and war, had become so twisted, so difficult to see. The next morning, the sound of trucks approaching broke the silence of the cabin. British reinforcements had finally arrived, bringing with them the promise of orders, of a plan to move forward. Richard's time with Elise had come to an end. His mission, the one that had haunted him, since his memory had returned, was still waiting for him. He stood, his body stiff but determined, pulling on his coat as he prepared to leave. The weight of the world seemed to settle on his shoulders, and he knew what was ahead. He had to return to Bastogne, to the heart of the battle where Jonathan awaited him. He needed answers. He needed to confront the man who had once been like a brother and who now seemed to hold the key to the darkness that had been set in motion. Before he turned to go, he looked at Elise one last time. She stood by the door, her expression unreadable but calm, like the stillness before a storm. "I'll come back for you," Richard said, his voice quiet, but filled with a resolve that surprised even him. It was a promise, simple but strong. Elise didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her eyes, steady and sure, locked with his. There was a shared understanding between them, one born of the quiet moments, the hardships they had faced together. It was a bond, unspoken, but unbreakable. He turned and stepped out into the cold morning air, the weight of his mission pulling him forward. As he walked away, he could feel the pull of the compass in his pocket, a reminder of the promises he had made, of the home he was still searching for, and of the woman he had left behind. But as the sounds of the reinforcements grew louder and the snow crunched beneath his boots, Richard knew that the road ahead was long. And no matter where he went, that compass would always be there, pointing him towards something, maybe even back to himself. Bastogne was a city that bore the scars of battle, its streets still echoing with the sounds of war, even as the dust began to settle. Richard arrived there, exhausted and hollow, but his resolve remained unbroken. The long journey, both physical and emotional, had taken its toll on him. But the weight of the truth he had carried with him from the moment he had escaped the woods, from the moment he had been left behind, was something he could no longer ignore. He met with Captain Samuel Leblanc, a Canadian intelligence officer who had become his ally during the weeks of uncertainty. Leblanc's eyes were sharp, the lines on his face deep from the strain of the war, but there was a kindness in his gaze that spoke of battles fought not just with weapons, but with the will to protect what little was left of humanity. With his help, Richard laid out the evidence, the damning documents that had been hidden within the seams of his uniform. As he unfolded them, each piece of paper seemed to burn in his hands. The orders were clear, the signatures unmistakably forged, all leading back to the one person he never thought capable of such betrayal, Lieutenant Jonathan Reed, the man who had once stood by his side, the man who had earned his trust, had sold out everything Richard had fought for. He had given vital information to the Germans in exchange for promises of security after the war's end. Jonathan's actions had jeopardized not only the mission, but the lives of countless men who had fought alongside him. With the proof now laid bare, Jonathan Reed was arrested. The once proud officer, who had walked with a swagger of confidence, was now just another prisoner of war, his hands bound in shame. Richard's mission had come to a close. The enemy had been exposed, the traitor caught, and yet there was no sense of victory to fill the emptiness inside him. He had done what he had set out to do, cleared his name, exposed the truth, but what remained was a hollow feeling that weighed heavily on his heart. His reputation was restored, the stain of betrayal washed away, but even with that victory, there was no triumph in his heart. His mind was not in Bastogne. It wasn't in the success of this operation, or even in the satisfaction of having brought justice to those who had wronged him. His heart was somewhere else, far away from the war, from the military base, from the people who surrounded him. His heart was in that small cabin in the Ardennes with Elise. It was there by the warmth of the fire, in the quiet moments they had shared. It was with her that he had found something he hadn't realized he had been searching for. Something more than the battlefield, more than the orders or the mission. He had found peace, a brief escape from the chaos of war, and in that peace, he had felt something resembling hope. As the arrest of Jonathan Reed made the rounds in Bastogne, Richard stood silently in the corner of a room, surrounded by soldiers and officers who spoke of the next steps, the continuing efforts of the war. But none of their voices seemed to reach him. He was somewhere else, caught in the memory of her calm eyes, her steady hands, and the promise he had made. "I'll come back for you," he had said to Elise. But the truth was, no matter what happened in Bastogne, no matter what victories he won or how many battles he fought, he wasn't sure when or if he would ever truly find his way back to her. The war had a way of taking everything, even the things that seemed certain. And as the weight of his own victory pressed down on him, Richard couldn't help but wonder if it was all worth it. His name had been cleared, his enemy had been caught, but the cost of it all seemed too high. The questions lingered in his mind, unanswered, as he stood in the midst of victory, feeling like a man who had won a battle but lost everything that truly mattered. 3 weeks had passed since Richard left, and Elise had settled into a quiet routine. The days were marked by the rhythm of the forest, gathering firewood, tending to the small cabin, and taking solace in the silence of the Ardennes. Yet, even in the solitude, her mind often wandered back to him, to the promise he had made, and to the words he had spoken as he left. "I'll come back for you." She had no idea when or if that would happen. War had a way of erasing certainty, and in the time since, she had come to accept that some things were simply out of her control. That afternoon, she was stacking firewood outside, the crisp winter air biting at her skin, when she heard the unmistakable sound of dogs barking in the distance. Her heart skipped a beat, her thoughts immediately leaping to the possibility that someone was approaching. Could it be him? Had he returned, as he had promised? But no. The sound wasn't the familiar crunch of boots in the snow. It was different. The noise carrying a sense of urgency. Moments later, a Canadian messenger appeared, his uniform dusted with snow, his breath visible in the cold air. He moved quickly toward her, his eyes focused, and in his hand, he held an official-looking letter. The seal of the 101st Airborne Division gleamed in the weak light of the afternoon. Richard's division. The messenger handed her the letter without a word, and she took it, her fingers trembling slightly as she turned it over. The paper was thick, the handwriting on the front unmistakably his. She broke the seal, unfolding the letter carefully, her eyes scanning the words that would forever change the course of her life. Dear Elise, I hope this letter finds you in good health, though I know it must have been difficult to adjust without the certainty of the war's end. I write to you not only as a soldier and a man whose life you saved, but as someone who has come to understand the power of the bond we share. You were more than a nurse to me. You were a guiding light in the darkest times, and your strength was the only thing that kept me from losing myself entirely. In the time since our separation, I have been given the opportunity to lead an initiative that is close to my heart. I've created something called the Moreau Initiative, an organization dedicated to helping the forgotten veterans who find themselves in the liberated zones of Europe. These men have been left behind, ignored by those who should care for them. But I cannot do it alone. I want you with me, Elise, not as a nurse, but as a partner, as the heart of this mission. You have more to offer than anyone I've ever met, and I believe that together we can do something that will make a real difference. This is not just another war effort. It's a chance to rebuild lives, to heal, and to offer hope to those who have been forgotten. I understand if you hesitate. This is a life you have not asked for, but I hope you will consider it. My need for you is not one of duty, but of something much deeper. You are the one who showed me what it truly means to fight, not just for survival, but for something worth living for. Please join me. I can't do this without you. Yours, Richard Callahan. Elise stood there, the letter in her hands, her breath caught in her chest. The words danced before her eyes, but it was the last part of the letter that struck her most deeply. I need you. She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing the weight of his request to settle in. It was a life she hadn't imagined, not in the midst of the war, not in the quiet of the Ardennes where she had found a semblance of peace. And yet, as the words echoed in her mind, she knew that Richard was right. They had been through something together, something that had tied them in a way that went beyond the simple roles they had played during the war. He had called her the heart of the mission, and something in her stirred at the idea. The idea of working side by side with him, of doing something greater than just surviving, was tempting. She had lived with the pain of loss for so long, but the thought of healing, of helping others in the way she had helped him, brought a sense of purpose she hadn't realized was missing. She looked out toward the forest, the vastness of it, the silence, and the peace it offered. But then her gaze turned back to the letter in her hands. Richard needed her, and maybe, just maybe, this was the chance she had been waiting for, not just to heal others, but to heal herself as well. With a deep breath, she made her decision. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her coat. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a spark of hope. A new chapter was waiting, and it was time for her to take the first step. As she prepared to leave, she thought of the quiet moments they had shared in the cabin, those small, tender spaces of peace amidst the chaos. She knew she was no longer just a nurse. She was part of something bigger, something that could change the world for the better. And as she walked back into the cabin, ready to pack her things, she couldn't help but smile. Richard had kept his promise. He had come back for her. Elise's journey to London was long, the weight of it settling on her shoulders as the train rattled through the countryside, the world outside passing by in a blur of grey skies and fog. She had left the silence of the Ardennes behind, and now, in the heart of war-torn Europe, she was stepping into a new world. The Moreau Initiative had started small, with a single campaign hospital in London, but the vision Richard had shared with her in that letter had grown far beyond what she could have imagined. This was no longer just about healing soldiers. It was about rebuilding lives, about giving people something to hold on to in a world that had taken everything from them. When she arrived, the city felt different, harsher, colder than she had remembered. The air smelled of smoke, and the streets were alive with the hurried pace of a world in constant motion. But despite the chaos, there was something new, something hopeful emerging within it. As she stepped into the hospital, the sight of it made her heart swell with a mix of pride and awe. It wasn't just a place for recovery, it was a sanctuary, a place for those who had lost everything to find a way forward. And then she saw him, Richard. He was different, unmistakably so. Gone were the crisp uniform and the medals that had once adorned his chest. Instead, he wore the plain white coat of a doctor, the sleeves rolled up, revealing the worn skin of a man who had given up everything in the name of something greater. His eyes, however, were the same, sharp, determined, but filled with something softer now, something warmer. He no longer carried the weight of battle on his shoulders, but the weight of something even more profound, responsibility. He was moving between beds, talking to soldiers with missing limbs, comforting widows, and offering solace to orphans, his hands busy with the delicate work of healing both the body and the soul. The work was exhausting, demanding every ounce of his energy, but there was a calmness to him now, a quiet strength that had not been there before. As she approached, he looked up. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, a smile spread across his face, and for the first time since they had parted ways, Elise saw something that made her heart skip a beat: joy. His eyes lit up in recognition, as if he had been waiting for this moment. For her. "I didn't come back just for you," he said, his voice low, yet filled with the weight of everything he had lived through. "I came back for everything you represent." Her heart fluttered at his words. She had always known that he had a deep respect for her, for the work they had done together, but hearing him say it like this, with such sincerity, made everything they had been through feel worth it. She smiled, feeling the rush of emotion flood her chest. "And did you finally find your home?" she asked softly, her voice trembling just slightly as she searched his face for the answer she had always wondered about. Richard's smile widened, and for a moment, the noise of the hospital, the frantic pace of recovery, faded into the background. There was only the two of them in that moment, sharing something that no one else could understand. "Yes," he replied, his voice steady, but filled with an emotion that was rare in men who had seen so much. "When I saw you again, I knew." In that instant, Elise understood. She wasn't just a part of this mission, she was its heart, its soul. She had always been the one to remind him of what was worth fighting for, and now, in this new world they were building together, he had found something he had been searching for his entire life. Not just a place, but a purpose. And it was with her, by his side, that he had finally come home. The room around them seemed to fade, and for the first time since the war began, Elise felt the weight of her own journey lift. She was no longer just a healer, a caretaker of the wounded. She was a part of something much bigger, a force for change, a force for good in a world that had been torn apart by war. And with Richard, she knew that they could rebuild what had been lost, piece by piece, heart by heart. As the sounds of the hospital rushed back in, they stood there together, silently, sharing a moment that would carry them forward through the challenges ahead. The war was not over, but for the first time in a long while, they were not fighting it alone. They had each other, and that was enough to begin again. Together, they built something that would outlast the chaos of the war. Their efforts spread from Belgium to the northern parts of France and even to Naples. Wherever wounded soldiers, both physically and emotionally, needed help, the Moreau Initiative was there. But this mission, born from a shared sense of duty, was more than just a lifeline for those in need. It became a place where something deeper took root, something that war could never take away. In the quiet moments, away from the hustle of recovery and rebuilding, Richard and Elise shared something that had grown between them in the midst of destruction. A love, steady and unwavering. Richard, the major who had been betrayed by the war he fought for. Elise, the nurse, who had saved lives with her hands and with the warmth of her heart. They were no longer just two souls surviving the same storm. They were partners, bound by a love that had been forged in the fire of battle and tested by time. Together, they had created something that transcended the war itself. They had built a home, something far greater than any battlefield or mission. A home where hope could grow, where healing could begin, and where love could find a place to thrive amidst the ruins. And on the nights when the cold of the past crept back in, when the shadows of the war seemed to loom just a little too close, Elise would look at the small silver compass on her desk. It was a gift Richard had given her, the same one he had carried for years. It pointed in one direction, never wavering, always reminding her of what they had built together. It pointed to him. The compass had always pointed toward home, and now it pointed toward the future they were building together. The future, beyond the war, beyond the scars of what they had endured. It pointed to a life where they could finally be more than just survivors. They could be builders, healers, and, most importantly, partners in every sense of the word. In a world that had taken so much, they had found something worth holding on to. And in the quiet moments, as they sat together by the fire, watching the world outside change, they both knew that this was just the beginning. The war might have ended, but the work they had started, the love they had found, was only just beginning to bloom. This story is not just about war or about the devastation it leaves behind. It's about the resilience of the human spirit, the quiet acts of courage that make a difference in the lives of others, and the love that can grow even in the darkest of times. What would you have done in their place? Would you have believed that love could survive such hardship, or would you have been consumed by the weight of loss? Did you already know this story? There are so many more untold stories of soldiers, veterans, and those who stand by them. Stories of courage, of pain, of healing, and of love. Stories that deserve to be heard. If this story moved you, don't let it be forgotten. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to hear more stories like this one. Let's keep the memory of these remarkable individuals alive, so their legacies live on for generations to come. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to sharing the next chapter with you soon. There are more stories out there, more lives, more heroes, and more love to uncover. Stay tuned.